Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Gary Cohn and Ron Biscardi to the stage.
Ron, where's your introduction?
You know, they don't seem to care about me the way they do you.
All right, well, I'll work on it.
So, just to let you all know what a nice guy Gary is, backstage, I said, you know, it's always nerve-wracking for me to have to interview someone as prominent as Gary. And he said, it's really not that big a deal. He goes, but if you're really worried about it, I can ask the questions too. So, I'd like to start with your background. So you obviously came from a very modest start in life, but you also came from an entrepreneurial family. Can you tell us a little bit about that, where you grew up, and especially the business you worked in as a kid?
So I was lucky enough to grow up in Cleveland, Ohio. And as you said, extremely modest background. You know, my parents never went to college. I'm first generation college educated in my family. My dad went right into my grandfather's business, which at the time was a tiny little electrical contracting business. My dad came out of high school, you know, went into the electrical union apprentice program and got his union card and worked that way. And I grew up in a union family and thought I was living a great life, didn't know anything different. So it all seemed, you know, really normal to me. I thought when you went to vacation for Christmas, you were supposed to drive to Florida and fight with your sisters in the backseat of the car. I didn't know you could fly to Florida. It's just the way it worked. And then as my dad and my uncle and my grandfather got more and more successful, they really were entrepreneurs trapped inside sort of realistic bodies trying to just earn livings for their family. They started, you know, more or less bartering as they were wiring retail space and wiring office buildings. They took equity in the buildings in lieu of payment for their services. You know, they would take enough payment to pay their men and pay for the material, but all of their profit went into equity in the buildings. So they ended up in the real estate development business. So, you know, I learned relatively early the entrepreneurial side of the business, and I learned, you know, that you had to run a pretty efficient business because it's all about managing costs when you're running a business like that.
Interesting, right? So they were kind of becoming deal guys, maybe without knowing it.
They were very much becoming deal guys. I mean, they were saying, look, as long as we can pay our labor and we can pay our materials, you know, we are willing to take investments in the enterprise and look for long-term capital appreciation versus take short-term income. So they definitely were becoming entrepreneurs and deal guys.
Very smart.
Yep.
So how did you go from there to Wall Street?
Oh, well, it's a very complex path. So I was born with pretty severe dyslexia. Still have it, still am. You don't outgrow it. So to say I was a poor student would be an overstatement. I was a horrible student. I was one of those typical kids in the 60s that got bounced from school to school to school as a quote-unquote disciplinary problem because you know, the teachers at that point thought that I just wouldn't do the work. If I would just work harder, I would be a better student and I wouldn't be disruptive to class. Right. You know, and there was a really poignant moment in my life, probably, you know, 5th or 6th grade, where, you know, teacher pulls my mom aside and teacher tells my mom, you know, if you're lucky, your son will grow up and be a truck driver. And, you know, in the back of my mind, I wasn't supposed to hear it, of course, but of course I heard it. And there was nothing more motivating for me than to hear that, because there were lots of things I could figure out in the classroom that a lot of other kids couldn't figure out. I just couldn't figure out how to write them down so anyone else could figure out what I was saying. But I knew what I was saying, and I could solve a lot of problems that other kids couldn't solve. So I ended up in a very interesting way as a nice Jewish kid going to a nice Catholic high school. They were the only ones that would take me. So I went to a nice Catholic high school, Brothers of the Holy Cross, where they have big, I don't know if I can say this, big-ass rings on their finger, and they have no problem using them on the back of your head. And so if my head has an indent in it, that's what happened. But, you know, in honesty, that was a school that was willing to spend the time, work with me, build a little bit of self-confidence, which allowed me, for some reason, to go to college. I mean, I was probably not a great college applicant. Went to college, got through college in 3 years because during one of my summers, I did an internship at a local Merrill Lynch office, and typical summer internship, a week in the back office, a week in equities, a week of fixed income, and most importantly, a week in commodities. And to put this in perspective, that had to be the summer of '80. This was during the Hunt brothers and the gold and silver market were going crazy. They had a gold arbitrage desk. They allowed me to open up a trading account, and I traded the London-Chicago gold arb for myself that summer, and took $10,000 and made it into an obscene amount of money. Told my dad I was dropping out of college, and he said, "No, you're not." Went back to school and continued to trade commodities from the payphone. Yes, I have to remind younger generations, there were no cell phones. From the payphone on the 1-800 line to the Merrill Lynch office. And of course, you all know the story because you're traders or investors. I proceeded to lose 100% of the money I made back. You'd put in a stop order in gold and get filled $8 lower, and you'd say this is impossible, and the guy would send you time and sales, and you got the dead low tick of the day. So I said, this is criminal. I've got to go to the floor of the exchange, because if you can't beat them, join them.
Right.
The old can't beat them, join them. So I graduated a year early. It just went straight through because my dad wouldn't let me drop out. And in essence, I went to the floor of the commodities exchange.
Okay.
And I went to the floor of the COMEX and worked my way, literally first job, $125 a week, being a runner, which is a great experience. It's a shame that physical exchanges don't exist anymore, because there's nothing like being the guy that gets the coffee and the lunch and being told every day you did it wrong. It's amazing how you can get everyone's lunch order wrong every day when you write down exactly what they told you and you bring it back. But it's a good experience. It's a great learning experience. And then within a year, I managed to finagle a way to get a seat on the exchange, got a seat on the exchange and started trading, traded on the exchange for a while. And then, I'll make this very quick, the Drexel bankruptcy happened. I happened to be on the COMEX Clearing Associate Executive Committee. So me and another person from Goldman Sachs, we were given the job of liquidating Drexel, which was very interesting. So it was the first time I really saw the OTC market, or the off-the-floor market, versus the floor market, working with the Goldman partner. That person then convinced me to come upstairs to Goldman. Went up there for a one-year trial. 27 years later, I left and went to the White House.
Wow.
That's a quick history.
Yeah, that's very impressive, though. And you left as the president of Goldman.
I left as the president, chief operating officer, after 10 years. So when Hank Paulson left to be Treasury Secretary, I became president, chief operating officer of the firm. So right through the financial crisis.
So can you tell us what was different about working in the White House versus working at Goldman Sachs?
Everything. People ask me this question all the time. The Goldman Sachs sort of culture is exactly what you think it is. It is a total collegial, team-oriented culture, everyone working together to serve a client and serve a client's needs and try and figure out how to get things done. And there are very, very, very few political games played at Goldman. I won't say there are none, but there are very, very few political games played at Goldman. When you get into the Washington arena, it's phenomenally interesting. And think about this, and this is how I always start thinking about this. Friday, it was a Friday this year. It was a Friday on inauguration. Friday, January 20th, at 11:59, the Obama people walk out of the White House. At 12 noon, a second later, the Trump people walk into the White House. We don't know each other. We've never worked together. We don't know what our skills are. We don't know what our skills aren't. We don't even know what we do. We don't even know what our offices are. We don't know our names. We don't know our email addresses. You're thrown into this and you're said, work together.
Right.
I mean, think about, this is the peaceful transition of power in the United States. 11:59 and 12 o'clock. That's when we do the peaceful transition of power. And you're then trying to figure out from that moment on who everyone is, what their skill set is. Are they telling me the truth? Are they communicating with me? Are they sharing knowledge with me? Are they playing politics? Are they not? Where in a firm like Goldman, the vast majority of people start as a first-year analyst or an associate if they come out of grad school, and you sort of work together in teams, and you sort of know everyone's strength and weakness early,
right,
versus taking everyone from the president all the way on down and throwing us into one office on the same day and saying, hi, these are the people you work with.
Yeah.
And so it takes a long time to figure out everyone's strengths and weaknesses. Now, you can actually figure out the good communicators relatively quickly. You can figure out the bad communicators relatively quickly. Mm-hmm. You can figure out the people that are willing to pitch in and help, and the team players, and you can figure out the non-team players relatively quickly. But outside of that, it's just an evolution process.
Did you do anything different specifically in your management approach? Because obviously that's a super challenging situation.
Well, look, I came from running Goldman Sachs, that base as the chief operating officer. I had 35,000 plus people reporting to me, probably too many, but 20 plus direct reports. Mm-hmm. I go into the White House. I have my NEC pretty well staffed out. The whole NEC staff is maybe 50, with 6 or 7 direct reports. And not a clear agenda of what's being worked on. And look, at Goldman Sachs, there's always a clear agenda. You know, serve your clients, make money. Mm-hmm. And if you get that reversed, it's okay. Make money, serve your clients. Right. You can do it in any order you want, and it works. In the White House, when you get there day one, you know, you're not even 100% sure what the agenda is, because if you roll back in time, before we got inaugurated as a team, Speaker Ryan had already made the strategic decision to repeal Obamacare. Mm-hmm. So had we been left to our own agenda, right, we would not have done Obamacare first, but it wasn't our agenda. Mm-hmm. It was the Speaker's agenda, because he already had put in motion inside the House the repeal and replace of Obamacare. So we literally walked in on that Friday, and we were working on Obamacare.
Okay. So, well, we know that went well. Let's talk about tariffs and China and trade. It's obviously well known that you left because you objected to tariffs.
Well, I am a globalist. Just so you know. I don't want anyone to forget that.
In case anyone didn't
In case
know.
anyone forgot. I remind people that globalist and realist
are the same thing.
The same thing, okay.
So tell us, what approach did you believe was the right approach at the time? Because clearly you didn't believe in tariffs. So how would you like to have seen it handled?
So let me back up for 1 minute and just explain a little bit of my passion. So as the president's chief economic advisor, and having all economic policy run through me, I assumed that my job was to give the president precise and accurate views on the U.S. economy. So
sounds reasonable.
It sounds like what you would think your job would be. So if you look at the U.S. economy, and this is true today, it was true then, and you start with the basics of what is the U.S. economy. The U.S. economy today is basically a service economy. We are 80+% of our jobs and 80+% of our GDP comes from the service sector. Mm-hmm. That means 20% or less comes from the manufacturing sector. So when I start with that premise, if you think about what drives growth, drives GDP, and drives jobs, you want to enhance the service sector. Mm-hmm. So then you think about how to do that. So you say, okay, people have disposable income. They start spending it in a waterfall. You know, in the waterfall, food's always first. You know, then you start going through the waterfall. You know, you have to buy certain goods to live. You know, you have to buy food, which is a good. Then you have to buy transportation. You want to make those goods as cheap as possible, so there's as much money left over to buy as many services as you can to grow the economy. And then, in that unique occasion, if they've bought all their goods and they bought all their services, they can save. Mm-hmm. That's not the typical American can get to save, but they can buy their goods and they can buy their services. So my point of view was, look, we should be in a position in this country to drive the price of goods down as low as we possibly can. And we happen to import the vast majority of our goods. Why would we want to put a consumption tax or a tariff, they're the same thing, on the goods that we import? So I said to the president, I said, look, we're a service economy. We import goods. We import cheap goods from around the world that Americans need to buy to live their everyday life. We should encourage that to be as cheap as possible. If you put a tariff on those goods will just become more expensive. It will not stop Americans from buying them, and it will not create factories in the United States to build those goods unless the tariff is so high that it really makes economic sense to do that, and we can actually build that factory because of environmental or other considerations that exist in the United States. And that will take many, many years to do. And the consumption tax or the tariff is being paid by the US consumer. It's not being paid by the foreign company.
So I assume it was that last point, which is why you don't believe it was really a stick against the Chinese in a negotiation.
No, I mean, look at the data for last year in itself. China had a record trade surplus year with us. They sent us everything we wanted to buy at the exact price they wanted to send it to us. And to the extent that the US put a tariff on it, some company in the United States or some unwilling consumer in the United States paid that tariff. No one in China paid that tariff.
Yeah. Okay, so how would you like to have seen it handled?
So look, there's a place where I think there's universal agreement in the world on China. China has been a very bad actor in their forced technology transfer, in their stealing of intellectual property, on their restrictive borders and not allowing US or other companies to come into China and really get access to their market. There's universal consensus on that. There's no one that doesn't agree with that. If you go back and look at the G7 communique from Taormino, back in the first G7, we literally crafted a document in that meeting that talked about all of the G7 countries, that's Japan, Europe, Canada, not China, all agreeing that the 7 countries would, as a group, go after China on forced technology transfer, on intellectual property, on access. And we were working pretty well together to do that. It was decided that Bob Lighthizer, the US Trade Rep, would bring the 301 action. Bringing a 301 action against China is a big, intricate legal process.
Can you explain what a 301 action is, just briefly?
Yeah, it's basically a dumping. It's basically says that you are prohibiting people from coming into your country, and you're dumping products into our country, and you're stealing things. We were proving a bunch of different things. 301 is it's part of Trade Act, and it's part of the international trade commerce legislations that go through. So we had consensus
among everyone.
There was consensus. There was consensus among the G7, and probably we could have got 50 or 60 or 70 other countries to sign onto the 301, or onto this trade action. So, but to do this in the right way, this is a multi-hundred-page filing. It's like any other court filing that you're filing with depositions and with cases and with facts and with all these issues to what the Chinese are actually doing to document it, to go to these international courts.
Okay.
And that was going along, and I would say that was going along rather well. And the countries were working well together, and the economic representatives between those countries were working well together.
And what do you think the time frame would have been to go through that process?
That process still went on a little bit because the United States did it by itself in the end. And that process, it's a year to a year and a half to do it well.
Okay.
So it's a year to year and a half to do a 301 investigation thoroughly. And now this is a broad one. You could do it on more specifically, but this is a very wide investigation of China and their anti-competitive tactics.
Okay.
And we were going after a lot of different areas. So you would have had to assume that that meeting, that G7 meeting, was in the spring of 2017. Mm-hmm. It was Memorial Day weekend. It was Memorial Day Friday we signed it. in Taormino. So it was going to be at least a year and a half from then, which would be about now. About now we'd be filing that action against the Chinese with all these countries, and then when we'd go get other countries involved to agree. And there would be many other countries that would agree. In the meantime, there's the, I would say, the nationalistic wing of the White House that had convinced the president that he wasn't doing enough on tariffs, wasn't doing enough on protecting U.S. industries and protecting the U.S. economy. And they came up with this idea that if they invited all of the CEOs of the U.S. steel and aluminum companies to the cabinet room for a meeting on a morning, that they would get the president to announce tariffs. And that's what happened. They got a meeting, they brought in the CEOs, and the president announced 10% aluminum tariffs and 25% steel tariffs. Right. Well, you would know exactly what happened. Canada sends us a lot of steel. The UK sends us steel. Japan sends us steel. Germany sends us steel. Italy probably doesn't send us that much steel. Not so much. But we can go, and France sends us steel. So now you've got the G7. So all of them called us up and said, look, we don't understand what's going on here. We're working with you on the big problem in the world. The big problem in the world is China. We all agree the big problem in the world. It's in the G7 communique. Why are you guys attacking us on something so insignificant as steel and aluminum? And they say, if you're going to not drop the steel and aluminum, we're not going to be with you on the 301.
So when this decision was made, did the president call you in before this press conference or this event with the steel industry executives and say, I've changed my mind, I'm going with tariffs?
No, I mean, that meeting with those executives was a long meeting in the cabinet room. I was in the meeting. It was a two-part meeting because somehow it miraculously got scheduled without being on his schedule. They showed up. The president actually had another meeting in the middle that was on a schedule that he went to, then he came back. And of course, a lot of this was on TV because the president invited the TV cameras in for the announcement of the tariffs.
Is that about when you started to lose your hair?
No.
No.
I worked at Goldman Sachs for 27 years.
No. Much earlier, okay. Okay, so that sounds like a bit of a frustrating experience. And I assume that it was that event, it was at that point when it was communicated to the rest of the G7 partners.
Yeah, look, the G7 partners had been working really well with us. It was frustrating, and they come back and say, hey, we don't get this. And, me and some of my colleagues, we didn't really have a lot to say to them.
So talks have started up again. What do you predict as the outcome of this?
So look, every time you sit down with the Chinese, you have two issues on the table. There's really two issues. One is the size of our trade deficit, right? It's about $330 billion a year of trade deficit, which the Chinese are happy to make that number smaller. I mean, they'll walk into almost any meeting and say, look, we're happy to buy more things from the United States. They're happy to buy more liquefied natural gas. They're happy to buy more agricultural products. They're happy to buy more things from the United States. So if all we're solving for is the size of our trade deficit, the Chinese can do that, and they can do that relatively quickly. Now, we really don't have a lot of natural gas excess supply. We'd have to build some facilities, but on the soybeans and the wheat and the corn, they could start buying those things today. To me, that's not really the big issue. The big issue is the intellectual property, forced technology transfer, and market access. That, to me, is the whole issue. The United States has to stand up for our big competitive advantage in the world. Our big competitive advantages in the world is we are a country of entrepreneurs, entrepreneurial capital, and inventors. We invent really phenomenal technology that the world needs, the world depends on, and we have to get fairly compensated for it. And if the Chinese are not willing to do that, then we are really putting our companies here in the United States in harm's way. And we all agree with that. And by the way, all the other countries in the world agree. They want to protect their intellectual property. They want to protect their creativity. To me, that's the hard part to solve. The hard part to solve is really the forced technology transfer as well as the intellectual property.
Okay. So let's shift to tax reform.
Okay.
So this was something you were very passionate about. You spearheaded the effort on the tax reform legislation. I guess why don't we start with why were you so passionate about it? Why was this such an important issue for you?
Look, it was important for one really simple reason. I felt like we as the United States and we as Americans had put ourselves in a horribly uncompetitive position in the corporate world. And why would we do that? Why would we as Americans incentivize companies to invert to other parts of the world, move their corporate offices, move their board meetings for the pure purpose of just lowering their tax rate and being good fiduciaries for their shareholders, because the tax differential went 100% to the shareholders. They did nothing different but change their domicile, change their corporate headquarters, and change where their board meetings are. And we all knew that you could get into Europe and get into, you get into certain parts of Europe and get into low teens and maybe even single-digit tax rates. And it just made absolutely no sense to me that the United States shouldn't be in a position to attract and retain and want businesses to expand in the United States. And look, when any company did this, and I saw this hundreds of times, companies do the sort of return on investment or return on an equity over some cycle. I can build here, I can build there, I can build the other place. Tax rates goes into that calculation. So the amount of money that you would have to make incrementally by being in the United States to compensate for that tax return, you never could get there. It would make no sense for you to build in the United States. And that just didn't seem to make sense to me. So, the view was that if we could lower the tax rate on the business side in the United States low enough to be competitive with the rest of the world, that we could then grow our economy at a faster rate than we were growing. We could create jobs at a faster rate than we had been. We could create more wage growth than we had been. And the incremental growth in the economy, jobs, and wages would pay for the reduction in corporate tax rates.
Got it.
But it's not that simple, okay? So when you first start out, you say, okay, let's cut the corporate tax rate. And let's leave the personal side alone, because, the personal side's fine. We have a top rate of 39.6. No one's really complaining. But what you realize very, very quickly is the United States really has three tax codes. We have a corporate tax code, we have a personal tax code, and then we have the tax code where most businesses in the United States file, probably everyone in this room, you all file as pass-throughs in one way or another. And then you get into this very long discussion of the spread between the corporate tax rate and the pass-through tax rate. So, and the pass-through tax rate is directly correlated to the personal tax rate. So once you get that spread over a certain percent, and it seems like the benchmark is 5%, once you get that spread over 5%, you can't really do anything without moving the pass-through rate. So we, in essence, were forced to deal with the personal rates to get the pass-through to corporate spread in line to where we could get the votes we needed to get tax reform passed.
That makes sense. I feel like the tax reform is, you hear it referenced frequently as the 2020 campaign is warming up. Mm-hmm. There's a lot of chatter about it, and I've seen it used many times as a way really to foment more populism.
Yep.
What are your thoughts on that, and how big of an issue is this? And do you think that if a Democrat wins, I guess it depends a lot on which Democrat, they could really just unwind all the work that you did?
So, again, I'm going to take the liberty of backing up 2 feet and then go forward. So, remember, when we did tax reform, the way tax reform is done, and this is the way the U.S. government works, so it's not tax reform. Everything's scored on a 10-year system. Boxing's 10-point, the government's a 10-year system. So when they talk about $1.5 trillion of deficit, that's over 10 years. So that's a 10-year scoring system that you get the deficit, and the revenue's 10 years. So we haven't even filed our first returns yet under the new tax code. In fact, the IRS is still releasing rules. At least they were releasing rules as of sort of December 31st for the new tax policies. No one even understands what their tax return is going to look like under the new tax system. Number two is we created this 5-year window for CapEx where people can do 100% expensing for CapEx. We're literally into year two, just started year 2 of the 5 years, and then we have an 80, 60, 40, 20 runoff. So there's a lot of wind left in this tax reform system. So, I love the fact that everyone says, oh, the tax stimulus is gone. The tax stimulus is not gone. We haven't even seen what the returns are. I think people will be surprised, both negatively and positively. So, I was in San Francisco the other day, and I had people yelling and screaming at me because people in California at the high end, their taxes are going up because they lost their deductibility of state and local taxes. Most of your taxes are going up too because you lost the deductibility of state and local taxes. But that's not how people are portraying this. They're portraying this as like it was a huge tax cut for the wealthy Americans. Let's actually see what the data looks like. Let's see what happens. On this issue of populism, I think this is an interesting issue. I don't know if it's a real issue with legs that sticks, but this issue's been with us now more or less off and on for the last 5 or 6 years. This is Occupy Wall Street. Yep. This is a bunch of the other movements we had. And I have more of an understanding of this issue every day. I really do. And even, I got asked recently about Occupy Wall Street. Look, I completely understand the frustration we have in the system. And I say something like this. Think of a system where if you're a kid in high school today and your academic advisor or your principal or one of the teachers you respect says, hey, look, you're a fairly bright kid. You should work your butt off in high school, take the SATs, get into college, borrow the money to go to college. Oh, by the way, you're going to come out with $250,000 of debt, which they don't really explain to you, and you can't get a job. You feel like the system did you in. You feel like you just got had by the system. Even if you come out with a job, but the wages that you're earning doesn't allow you to live and pay off your debt and your college student loans, I understand why you're aggravated. I really do. You and I could sit here and understand the frustration that kids in this generation have. Part of me thinks, and this is a bigger discussion, that the whole metrics for success in our school system has to go back to more what it was, when my father grew up, and maybe when I grew up, because look, they told my mom I'd be the truck driver, and maybe I should have been.
I think it worked out for you.
It worked out okay. And the metric should be, and we might get completely different answers, maybe the metric should be, if kids graduate from high school at 18, 5 years later at 23, how many kids today are self-sufficient or self-sustaining at 23? So take that same student who's a decent student that can go borrow the money, can go to college, but I don't know what job they're going to get. What happens if they became an electrician, a carpenter, or a plumber? By the way, there's ads all over this country for carpenters, electricians, and plumbers starting at about $70,000 a year with full benefits. That person over the next 5 years is going to earn $350,000 with no debt versus someone earning creating $250,000 of debt and no job. You've got a $600,000 swing between those two people. I think we've got to reevaluate this metric that everyone needs to go to college. Everyone needs to get a college education. It may be the wrong benchmark. Also, on this whole populist movement in the corporate world, look, I was in Davos last week. I wasn't there long. I was there for about 24 hours. But Davos is all about this whole new globalism 4.0. I'll just let you know, if you don't know what 1, 2, and 3 were, no one in Davos did either. So you're in with the majority of what 1, 2, and 3 were. But I made a presentation. I said, maybe Davos 4.0 is really about writing the rules for the world we live in right now. Because you've got people running around the world saying, look, companies aren't doing enough. Companies need to change the way they think. And by the way, if that's the world we're going to live in, I don't have a problem with that. But the world we live in right now, legally and emotionally, and more importantly, legally, is that shareholders expect outside directors, and by the way, the management team, to optimize their returns. And so if I'm a board member of a public company today, or even a private company today, I expect you to protect my investment. So I don't expect you to give away money that ultimately is mine. I expect you to return the money to me as the shareholder, and if I want to give it away, I'll give it away. And I've actually had that experience from shareholders. You know, in a Goldman Sachs experience, I went and visited my 20 largest shareholders with the then CFO when we wanted to make a donation to our GS Foundation, and 20 out of 20 shareholders said, it's not your money, it's our money.
Right.
Give it to us. We'll decide where to give it away, or we'll reinvest it.
Sure.
So if we want to change the paradigm, what people have to understand is all the rules have to change.
Right, it's a big shift.
It's a big shift.
Okay, well, tells us on the timer here, we have 10 minutes left for Q&A.
Okay.
So does anyone have a question for Gary? And please stand up if you're going to ask a question.
Stand up.
Hi, Gary. One thing I don't understand is the Chinese government in terms of the IP and forced technology transfer. Why is it such a difficult thing? You would think they would just easily say, okay, we won't do that, or we haven't done that. Well, I don't understand why that's such a stumbling block.
Well, they do it. So any of you that have businesses in China, or any of us who have had businesses in China, if you want to have a business there, you have to put your technology into China. It's just the rules of what governs China. And the basic answer from the Chinese are, look, if you don't want to put your technology here, you don't have to have an office or a business here. It's as simple as that. It's a little bit like if you don't put your seatbelt on in the airplane, they're not going to take off.
Another question?
Hi, how are you doing? Right here.
I see you.
One of the first decisions of the administration was to cancel the TPP. What was wrong with the TPP as a way of containing China? Because I think that was a little bit what was behind it, no?
So that was a wonderful decision of my best friend, Peter Navarro. Peter Navarro
best friend figuratively.
My best friend figuratively, yes. My best friend, Peter Navarro, the Amazon economist. Peter is a total 100% nationalist who believes that trade deficits are bad, that believes that we should be an isolated, closed border country, that we should make and manufacture everything here, believes in no comparative advantage, believes in no trade deficit, believes in anything, that we should have trade surplus with every country. So Peter had a bunch of day one executive orders that he wanted the president to sign. We got the vast majority of them killed. That was one that sort of we couldn't kill for a variety of reasons. And it sort of snuck through. It didn't sneak through. We knew it was going through. And I agree with you. What TPP was supposed to do, in many respects, and it's the right thing, it was supposed to open up the agricultural markets of Asia Pacific to the US farmers, which is exactly what we want to do. We want to export more agricultural products from the United States out to the Asia Pacific region, and it's something that I supported and many of us supported in the White House, and unfortunately, the president withdrew from that. But like, I will never fully understand why we got rid of TPP. It's a good agreement.
Question back there.
Thanks for the time. I have a two-part question. Going back to your taxes, you mentioned that we don't know the outcome of that yet, but we do have a sneak peek. There's been 3 quarters of tax receipts. They've been down demonstrably year over year. The most recent was announced this morning, $200 billion decrease. That's a 30% year over year change. Obviously, you think that this trend is going to change for the better. That also coincides with the second year of $1 trillion of debt issuance for budget deficits, to cover the budget deficit. Why do you think that trend is going to change, ultimately making the tax cut beneficial to the country? And second, do you know of a general contractor who will renovate my kitchen for $1,000? Because if you do, I'll win a ton of points with my wife.
Okay, great. So on the tax receipt question, when we modeled the 10-year model, we had tax receipts going down quite dramatically year 1, 2 and a half, because we assumed that a lot of companies would take the opportunity to invest and expense CapEx and do 100% write-offs in the early years. So there was enormous discussion about how much CapEx would go into the system in the first couple of years and how much job creation and permanent wage growth that would create in the back end of the tax plan. So our revenue curve looked down and up dramatically, and we had modeled that in literally from day one. That's why I said, when you look at these projections, we do everything over a 10-year window. Now, look, that's, and by the, I don't really approve of that you do it over a 10-year window, because no tax plan ever stays intact for 10 years, so you can never know if you were right or wrong. It will get, this tax plan, like every other, will get changed multiple times in the 10-year window. And so you'll have to see what goes on here. You also have a bunch of other, minor factors that come through in tax planning, but that's really the reason for the lack of revenue this year is that we expected that to happen on some of the CapEx spending. And where we're seeing the CapEx spending, interestingly, we didn't get this as right, but it's actually logical once you see it. We've seen massive CapEx spending in the small, medium-sized businesses. So where you don't need long-term planning processes and you don't need boards, we've seen a lot of the, what I would call neighborhood service businesses. The guy who owns the pizza parlor go open a second or a third. The dry cleaner open a second or a third. The local regional businesses have done enormous amount of CapEx spending. We've not seen the CapEx spending in the big bucket yet, and hopefully we'll see that in the time to come.
Great. We have time for one more. Back there.
Thanks. In your time at Goldman Sachs, you had clear rules to deal with in terms of accounting, dealing with accrual accounting. And then you get to the government, and arguably, we live in Never Never Land of cash-based accounting. And so in that context, as National Economic Advisor, how do you give the president advice with respect to what the future obligations are of the nation under the entitlement programs, and how does that factor into your thinking as it relates to this tax proposal that you championed?
Well, you're 100% right on all aspects of the government spending, deficit, balance sheet. It's all very peculiarly done. The fact that if we go out and buy a building or buy property, plant, and equipment, it has zero value on our balance sheet. We just have deficit. So there's two sides of this story. I am one of those that does believe, and we were having this discussion last night, yes, so that's why there's a smile here. I am one that does believe that deficits do matter, and that at some point, the ability to finance your deficit does start having negative consequences on your economy. Although we can continue to print our currency and we continue to monetize our own deficit, and we do have that going for us, unlike some of the countries in Europe, I do believe the deficits do matter and that we do have to get some type of fiscal control here. One of the things that I'm now spending a bunch of time looking at that I'm on the outside because no one will touch it on the inside is Social Security and the Social Security Trust Fund. You can look at the Treasury report. They even admit in their report that it runs out in 2034, which is a very short time from now. 34% of revenue collected by the U.S. government goes to the Social Security Trust Fund. It's still a big flow of income. The bigger problem we have in this country, and the last two questions, interestingly, have been sort of debt and revenue. I'm pretty convinced, I'm not going to say I'm 100% convinced, I'm pretty convinced, though, that we have much more of a spending problem in this country than we have a revenue problem in this country. And that may be a provocative thought, but we tend to just spend money based on how we spent money last year plus a little bit more. And I bet you everyone in this room, if you had a financial problem in your house, you would cut down on expenditures, you wouldn't just think you could get more money somewhere miraculously. You probably just wouldn't go borrow more money. You probably would deal with the expense side of the equation. We don't deal with the expense side of the equation. If you're a cabinet secretary and last year your budget was X, this year your budget has to be X plus some percent. I don't know why, but that's the way it has to work in the government. And especially if some other cabinet secretary is X plus 2%, you better be X plus 2% or X plus 2.1. You can't be X minus 2%. So we have this just natural ability to grow the size of the expenditure side of the budget no matter what. We don't really ask or evaluate, does this make sense what we're spending money on? I'll pick another favorite topic, then I know we're over, but I'll just talk about this. Like, we just launched the U.S. Ronald Reagan, $13 billion aircraft carrier. $13 billion for the ship. Forget about the planes on it. Forget about the men and the women that serve on it. Forget about everything on it. Like, aircraft carriers 30 or 40 years ago was probably the most advanced piece of equipment in the world that we needed to fight military battles anywhere in the world. Today, there are multiple countries that could take that aircraft carrier out with one single bomb. Literally, you'd take $13 billion out with a bomb. And by the way, there's no place in the world we can't reach with planes based in the United States. I mean, but we keep buying aircraft carriers because we've been buying them for 50 years. So if we bought them last year, we should buy them again this year. And you know what? We keep buying tanks and we keep buying this other stuff. And I'm not sure how valuable aircraft carriers are and tanks are and all the other things we have that we just keep buying. In fact, we just approved well over $700 billion of defense spending. Now, 350 of that goes to personnel and retired personnel, but 350 of it goes to, a lot of it goes to metal.
Yeah.
And I don't know, look, I don't know how valuable that metal is in this day and age, but by the way, whatever we spend this year, we're gonna spend it next year plus a little bit more. So to me, we obsess on the revenue side. I wish we'd start obsessing on the expense side.
All right. So just real quick, when we chatted about this last night, you made an interesting point in that we don't mark these assets on the balance sheet of the country. Ballpark, I know some people have analyzed this. What do you think they're all worth if you put them on the balance sheet?
Who has any idea? Because what's the Capitol building worth? What's the mall worth? What's the Smithsonian worth? What's the art in the Smithsonian we could probably value.
Right.
But what are all the post offices worth? What are all the thousands of VA hospitals around the country worth? What's an aircraft carrier worth? Probably nothing. No one really needs one. F-15s, B-1s, those are probably interesting. A lot of people like supersonic jets. I mean, God only knows, but it's trillions of dollars.
Right.
It's not zero, the asset side of the balance sheet.
Right. So it does.
I mean, the U.S. government owns land and acreage and national parks. I mean, if you really value the asset side of the U.S. government balance sheet, yeah. I think you'd be surprised, if you were looking at this in GAAP accounting, that every time you bought an asset, you marked it to market or you put it on the balance sheet, it would be pretty interesting.
Right. Well, I still disagree with him and I disagree with you, but you run Goldman and I run Context, so nobody really cares what I think.
Right now, you're paying the bill, so I'm going to agree with you.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Everyone, Gary Cohn. Great job. Thank you.